Hello, students. Lesson 5 is going to focus on the criticisms of the New Deal, both those leveled upon it at its time and also later by historians and economists. And oftentimes it's seen as either not going far enough, going too far in expanding the role of the federal government, which it does to a great degree, or that many of its programs tended to leave out sometimes the most vulnerable groups in society. In a general sense, many criticized the Keynesian economics of pump priming that Roosevelt favored. Looking at Roosevelt's efforts not as being directed at resolving economic issues, but more as a way to shore up Democratic loyalty and the support for voters for the Democratic Party, because he was, pumping money into their problem, sort of throwing money at the problem, not necessarily with a goal in mind, was the criticism there. But when we look at some specific programs, there you can see that there are some flaws with those too. In the agricultural side of things, the AAA does accomplish its goal of raising crop prices, but that also means food prices are going to go up at a time when many Americans don't have a lot of money. And in addition, paying farmers to not farm aspects of their land, which is what decreases the supply and helps with the overproduction problem, but it also encourages farmers to plow under crops and sometimes destroy livestock at a time when you had Americans starving and they were destroying food. And then, of course, tenant farmers, if you lived on a plot of land that, a landowner decided they were not going to put into production that year, you were essentially out of a job, right? Because it was not your land and you didn't get to choose how to use it. Farm subsidies do stabilize the farm market, but it does contradict the free enterprise concept of sort of competition between farmers, which did lead to the problems that they was trying to address. And it seemed that the large farms tended to benefit more from this, and that tenant farmers and sharecroppers were almost left out completely from the farm subsidies benefits. The Tennessee Valley Authority, while it does build dams and provide electric power in an area where it wasn't really profitable for private companies to go in, it does also mean that the federal government is now competing with these companies. They are now getting into an industry of providing electric power, and critics leveled the charge that it was socialist. And the power companies complained that they couldn't compete with the government because, the government doesn't have to pay taxes, and the government doesn't have to turn a profit. The Tennessee Valley Authority did not have to actually make money. They just had to cover their own expenses, which meant that they could charge customers significantly less. Social Security does, early on target the disabled and the elderly for assistance, but it does leave out large segments of the population, particularly domestic workers and farm workers, which tended to be people of color, particularly African Americans. You kind of notice a pattern here that people of color get left out a lot. Sharecroppers, many of them were also African American. The Social Security Administration also provided smaller benefits to widows than to widowers, the logic being that women needed less money for whatever reason to live on than men. So there was some sexism built into it. And even through to today, Social Security is one of the most popular of the New Deal programs, but there's always concerns about whether or not we can continue to fund it. Do we have enough money to continue paying for retirement? Because it currently, people currently working are paying for people who are currently retired. And right now, the baby boomers, the largest generation in American history, are starting to retire, and there's a question as to whether or not there will be enough funds to continue to supply their retirement. The Federal Housing Administration specifically excluded African Americans from the low interest loans through a practice called redlining. They labeled predominantly black neighborhoods as being too risky of getting loans, and also worked to exclude African Americans and other people of color from moving into white neighborhoods. So while it's helping a lot of white Americans for the first time own homes, which is a way of sort of building wealth that you can pass on, it excludes people of color. And that is a purposeful part of that law. Individual groups and people from both the conservative right and the liberal left criticized the New Deal. Conservatives tended to see it as going too far, expanding the government's authority beyond what it should have been. Many of these conservatives were Republicans, like Herbert Hoover and Robert Taft, son of William Howard Taft, who believed that the New Deal threatened the free enterprise system and the individual freedoms by telling businesses how to operate their businesses. They, along with business leaders and some Democratic leaders who were on the more conservative side, formed the American Liberty League, whose pin we see on the screen right now. And they considered this sort of a betrayal of the Democratic Party's principles of limited government. Because remember, back in the 1930s, you had conservative and liberal Republicans and conservative and liberal Democrats. And they saw this as too much wasteful spending. The government was spending too much money and racking up a huge national debt. On the left side of the spectrum, the Socialist Party candidate for president, Norman Thomas, thought that the New Deal didn't go far enough, that it was primarily designed to prop up the existing capitalist system without really addressing the underlying problems of it by helping out the banks and big businesses. On sort of neither the left nor the right, but the kind of populist cherry-picking aspect of it, there are several individuals who will claim to represent or speak for the poor against the elites and become critics of the New Deal. Dr. Francis Townsend from California called on the federal government to provide a sort of basic income of $200 a month to any American over the age of 60, in the assumption that they would then go out and spend it to stimulate the economy. The gentleman on the left of this slide is Father Charles Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest from Canada and host of a talk radio show. Now, at first, he supported the New Deal, but then started to become critical of it as not going far enough. He called for the nationalization of industries in America, having the government basically take it over and run it in the interest of the people. And Coughlin is something of a demagogue, and like many populist demagogues, he resorts to anti-Semitism. He claims that Jews and communists are secretly running the government, and there's this connection between Judaism and communism that many paranoid anti-Semites like to point out, which is, if it needs to be said, not actually true. It's a conspiracy theory with no evidence of that. Appalled by his actions, the Catholic officials eventually forced him to stop broadcasting his radio show. The man on the right there is Senator Huey Long, who was seen by some historians as being almost like a small dictator of his home state of Louisiana. Such was the reach of his political and economic power there. He proposed what he called a share the wealth program, which was a high tax on the rich people and on corporations to redistribute the wealth. Unlike some of the New Deal programs, Long really didn't have a lot of thought put into how exactly this would work. It was mostly a way for him to gain popularity and to win votes and to gain power. And if he had run against Roosevelt in the presidential race, he may not have won, but he certainly would have drawn enough support away from Roosevelt for him to lose. However, in his rise to power in Louisiana, Huey Long made a lot of enemies, and one of them killed him in 1935. By far the greatest obstacle politically to FDR's New Deal is going to be the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was largely conservative in its views of government and the economy, and they struck down many New Deal programs as being unconstitutional. In the landmark Schechter Poultry v. United States, the so-called sick chicken case, great name for a case, the Supreme Court ruled that the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, was unconstitutional because it gave the president too much power to regulate interstate commerce, which was only a power to Congress. And this is going to kind of gut a central pillar of the first 100 days, first New Deal. They also ruled a key aspect of the AAA was unconstitutional. Now, to combat this, Franklin Roosevelt is going to propose adding 6 new justices to the Supreme Court in a scheme that his critics will call court packing. And certainly these would be people who were much more friendly to his New Deal programs and be willing to vote to keep them up. Now, his argument is that the Constitution does not say how many members of the Supreme Court there are, so they can pick that, but critics very astutely, accurately point out that this is an attempt to increase his presidential power by choosing who is going to be on the court and not dealing with the justices that he had. This is going to cause a big kerfuffle, if you will, politically for Roosevelt and for Congress. But what will end this is Roosevelt never does pack the court. They have what's called the switch in time that saves 9. Justice Robert J. Owen, who had voted against a lot of New Deal programs, starts voting in favor of them in court cases, which saves the court as a 9-justice court instead of a 15-justice court. They ruled, Robert Owen provided the key vote in ruling minimum wage and the Wagner Act both being constitutional. And as these older justices, many of them were much older, began to retire, Roosevelt was able to appoint new justices friendlier to his point of view to the Supreme Court. But he had done quite a bit of damage to himself politically. Roosevelt was very popular among the American people because of his willingness to take bold action in the face of the Great Depression. But this seemed something like a bit of a more naked power grab on his part, and really would have thrown the balance of power between the executive branch and the judicial branch off more than a lot of American voters were willing to accept. And as a result, the public becomes less willing to support New Deal legislation in the future. There will still be programs and laws put into place, but Roosevelt isn't able to just sort of get whatever he wants, and he starts to kind of cool off a little bit on these New Deal programs. In addition, in the late 1930s, Roosevelt is becoming much more concerned with events in other parts of the world as World War II is starting. If we look at the graphic organizer for this, there's 3 sections. The first section give you some specific programs and aspects of the New Deal, and I just want you to tell me what was the criticism of that program or aspect. In the second section, we look at some groups and people there. I want you first to identify who they were, as in who made up this group or who was this person, and then explain what their opposition to the New Deal was. And in the last part, we focus specifically on the Supreme Court, and they just answer those questions there at the bottom. That'll get you through sort of how the Supreme Court opposed it and the conflict between them and Roosevelt. Zeroing in here, I filled in the first part of the first one of the second part, which is on conservatives, who they were, Hoover, Taft, and other Republicans, and why they opposed the New Deal, threatening of free enterprise, individual freedom, and telling businesses how to operate. Te amo, ciao.